If you practice mindfulness, you're probably aware of its effect on your mood and your relaxation. But have you ever wondered what it does to your brain or what it does for your brain? Well, that's what today's guest will talk about. Hi, my name is Ingo Rao. Welcome to the School of Becoming, where we together with a team of supporters as well as Manage Magazine curated a series on mindfulness. Today's guest is Associate Professor Norman Farb, who is at the University of Toronto, Mississauga campus. He's also the director of the RAD Lab, the Regulatory and Affective Dynamics Lab, where he conducts research on mental habits and how they affect our well-being. In this class, he will talk to us about how mindfulness changes our brain. And with that, welcome, Norman.
Hey, thanks so much, Ingo, and thank you so much, everyone, for attending. I'll try to make the next hour or so worth your while. We'll talk about some research in my lab and some other people's labs that helps unpack a bit what's going on when people get into mindfulness training. And I should know that there are many other researchers who are studying like the most advanced practitioners who have been practicing for like 30,000 hours, up on a cave in a hill somewhere. That's not so much where my research is going to focus. I'm focusing more on what happens to people when they first get into mindfulness practices. And I'm going to skip over the whole pitch for why you might be interested in mindfulness because you've already signed up for a talk on mindfulness and sort of try to dive right in to get into a little bit more content. But I'll give a little bit of a prologue with this idea that we all have an understanding as adults that not every moment in our lives are going to be the best moment ever, but we have this sort of aspiration or hope that in general we're going to improve our lives despite the ups and downs. And so, you may have a success at work, then have some sort of criticism, but eventually, hopefully, you get some kind of promotion and move into a better role or find a job that's more meaningful, more fulfilling, and that things move up and up. But we all have our sort of aspirations and ideas for how things are going to go. And the reality of our situations sometimes is that, our best intentions are short-lived and things get in the way. And then before we know it, we're not always living on the sort of upward trajectory as we might have hoped. And so despite our kind of best of intentions, sometimes we sort of fall off of this ideal plan for ourselves where things get better and better, and we can find ourselves becoming kind of stuck, right? Back into our old way of being, or even find things deteriorating. And I think that life through the pandemic has been a very good example of this, where many of the people I speak with, and for myself as well, you have this idea of it sort of wears on you that you have to change the way you approach your everyday, and there's the uncertainty of the future, and this kind of feeling that the meaningfulness of days sometimes goes down when you're just sort of repeating your own sort of activities in isolation. And so where do we find a sense of purpose, enjoyment, meaning in the face of our external circumstances not always showing up the way we want, and especially in the face of major changes? So for every person who's just trying to deal with the boredom of a routine during the pandemic, there are also people who have lost their livelihoods, have reduced income, have increased stress due to caregiving duties or other facets of their life. So how do we kind of gracefully negotiate these sorts of stressors so that we don't kind of experience this chronic state of being prepared as though we're going to get away from a predator, our bodies are reacting as though there's an acute stressor, but now it gets stretched over time, which leads to these feelings of being overwhelmed or burnt out, as these two little kind of cartoons often show. And there's the idea that mindfulness training is going to help us more gracefully navigate these sorts of situations. And mindfulness, I would say, is one of many things that people could do to address their stress. And I have a few other commonly endorsed ways of trying to manage stress listed in this little infographic here, including spending time with others, getting physical exercise, spending time in nature, practicing gratitude, helping others. And these are all kind of interesting access points. And I think they might actually share some common mechanisms. So I don't mean to pitch what I'm saying as this is exclusively what happens in the brain when people do mindfulness training, but it's sort of the topic I know the most about. But it may be that there are other access points to a common sort of transformational pathway, and I think it's important to sort of think about that. I'll come back to that idea a bit towards the end of my presentation. And of course, people are trying to sell you all sorts of things that are supposed to be good for you, and so one of the reasons I think it's important to see a talk like this and that I do the work I do is that understanding, and not just understanding in a conceptual way, but really testing out your ideas about how things work is important for making skillful choices about how you're going to try to take care of yourself, right? If everything is just a matter of opinion, then any intervention, anything you do is just as good as anything else. And we know that there are obviously like boundaries to that, like mindful poison eating is probably not going to be as good as mindful breathing, because objectively the fact is poison will hurt you. But there's a big gray area between like the things we know are good for us and things that are obviously bad for us, where we don't really know whether a new sort of technique or approach is going to be helpful for us, and understanding some of the underlying mechanisms, like how something works, helps us make more skillful decisions as to whether you think it will work for us. And also when something is marketed to us, like, does it have a sensible mechanism? So we already kind of have a sense that mindfulness is helpful. A lot of people have reported benefits already. And I think part of the challenge is understanding, well, why is it helpful? How does it work? And is there ways that we can refine some of our techniques to maximize those useful ingredients to mindfulness practice? Are there other things we might want to discard? And also, if we want to evaluate other techniques that sound kind of like mindfulness or may have something to overlap, do they also start to tap into these mechanisms? So I'll show just for people, this is probably preaching to the choir a bit. The most common definition for mindfulness is the one popularized by John Kabat-Zinn, who developed mindfulness-based stress reduction, the first manualized secular, like non-religious intervention that delivers mindfulness training in the West. And I'm going to talk about mindfulness here by sort of decomposing this definition into three pieces, a tripod of mindfulness, if you will, which is that mindfulness involves doing something on purpose. So there are times that we have awareness or are mindful naturally, but we're trying to actually cultivate, we're trying to change something about ourselves. So it has to be some intentionality there. So mindfulness means doing something on purpose. And the thing that we're doing has two kind of components. One is an attentional component. So we're trying to direct our mind to filter out certain types of experiences and prioritize having awareness of other types of experiences. And that's the attention part of mindfulness. And the other part of what we're doing is we're trying to play with, explore, and cultivate positive attitudes, right? So paying attention on purpose, but without lapsing into sort of reflexive negative judgments about ourselves. We're trying to do present moment awareness in a sort of non-judgmental, and to put it in a more positive term, like in a kind of curious, open, and accepting fashion. So on purpose, we're guiding our attention to particular facets of our experience, and we're using that time to play with and model different types of attitudes that we might have by default. And the idea is that if we can raise these levels of acceptance or curiosity, and we can stabilize our attention, and we can learn how to do that in a kind of safe playground of, meditation when things are relatively stable and quiet for us, then we'll be able to bring these same skills to meet adversity, to meet stress, and it will help us make better choices, or at least do less harm to ourselves in the face of this stress. So mindfulness training, when people embark on taking an 8-week course or signing up to do an app or just practicing on their own, aims to sort of cultivate these qualities. Right. And just to reiterate, the qualities are, well, first of all, being able to set and hold an intention, and then the quality of being able to have stable attention towards something that you choose to pay attention to, and to marry in this attitude of curiosity, acceptance, non-judgment as something that might actually be a capacity that is actually cultivated. Right? It's not that we don't necessarily come ready to be fully open and accepting and stable in our attention, and that this is going to have some benefit for us. And if it's true that we're really changing the way we relate to our experience, and we're doing that in a a deep and meaningful way, it should also show up in the brain, right? Because the brain is, regardless of your philosophical orientation, at least a mirror of what is happening in terms of our felt experience. And so if we're really changing the quality of our experience, something must also be changing in the brain. And understanding how things are changing in the brain might help us even deepen understanding of what's happening under sort of behind the scenes with our qualitative experience. Now, we already know, and actually when I started doing this sort of research coming out of grad school a decade or two ago, we already kind of knew that mindfulness training is helpful, and I'm not really going to focus too much on that. The evidence keeps growing that across a variety of different sources of distress or suffering, mindfulness can be helpful in general. It might not work for every person who does a course of training, but in general, you get what we would consider like medium effect sizes or small to medium effect sizes in science, where the average person will tend to get some relief from anxiety, depressive symptoms, from obsessing or limiting themselves because of chronic pain. And there's sort of a widening scope of tweaked mindfulness interventions now that are showing efficacy across a wide array of sort of mental health and also physical disorders. That it can help people stop feeling so burnt out, even in really high stress situations. And whereas that may have traditionally been the purview, of physicians, I think a lot of us are sort of in this kind of long-term attrition situation now, where burnout is a real problem. And so what's happening when people burn out, and why does cultivating this attention and attitude help address that, is a really fascinating question. And as I mentioned just a couple of seconds ago, if you pick a particular disorder, a particular problem, you can probably find someone who's working on a mindfulness application for it. So I think if there are sort of more general principles about what makes for a good mindfulness intervention that are fairly universal, we really should try to get some clarity on that. And I'll give some hints about that in the next few minutes. At the same time, while there are sort of these medical or scientifically validated interventions coming into the common sphere, there's been a huge wave of commercial innovations as well, some of which are evidence-based, most of which are not. And so the dark side to the popularity of mindfulness is you're going to be sold quite a few things, and they're all going to be branded as like, this is mindfulness and mindfulness is good for you. But again, without understanding really what the mechanism of action is, it's hard to tell whether a given app or, a scented candle or something like that is really going to deliver on the promise that like an 8-week manualized group intervention would deliver, which is really what the science comes from, right? Is from having people come to these clinical groups. But there's no regulatory body that says you can only say mindfulness if it's in this format, but not if it's a scented candle. Like you can just slap mindfulness onto anything. It's just like you can slap yoga onto anything. And so again, we must be it would help to have some sense of like what really makes for an effective mindfulness intervention and what doesn't, if we're going to not get duped into something that is called mindfulness, but actually bears little resemblance to the actual the family of wholesome practices that are generating sort of high level scientific evidence. So I want to talk about just one model of how mindfulness may be working. And I don't want to exclude anyone else's model. And I definitely don't want to exclude anyone else's experience, but this has sort of been my own journey as a scientist into understanding mindfulness, talking about kind of 3 major stages and then maybe some practical implications of those stages. And I want to talk about some brain research that supports these ideas. So the first sort of step in this journey when people start practicing, I think, is a renegotiation of how they relate to their own experience, how they think about themselves. And I'm going to talk about that. If you change the way you think about yourself, and maybe even think about yourself isn't the right term, and the way you construct your sense of self-knowledge, that will change how you feel in particular situations. And I really mean the how part of how you feel. Like, it's not going to change sad to happy. It's going to change how you feel certain emotions, how you feel your way into situations. And if you change the way in the moment that you experience your emotions, that actually might have really important consequences for your long-term mental health. So are you going to be resilient to a chronic stressor like a global pandemic, for instance? Or are you going to sort of be overwhelmed and suffer? And I think going through a set of studies that speaks to each of these 3 stages is going to yield a few practical criteria that we could use to evaluate our own practices, and also the types of things people pitch to us as being good for us, and maybe branded as mindfulness. All right, so now we're going to go into some real content, I think, starting with this idea of how mindfulness training or mindfulness practice may affect our sense of self, our sense of identity. And I'd say traditionally, this wasn't really an accessible question because identity was thought of as sort of one thing, right? Probably most commonly, identity is thought of as like how we create ourselves as characters in our own story, right? As the philosopher Daniel Dennett says, the center of narrative gravity, as an entity that exists over time, that can possess traits, that can be held accountable. There is like a thing that is me, and it has qualities that could change over time, but part of how it's defined is by the fact that it is stable over time. And that helps us figure out how we should relate to the world, how we should relate to other people who also have these sort of constructed identities, and also what to expect for the future. So there's actually a lot of really important things about having this sort of stable, constructed sense of self. We also know just from psychological research, if I can get my slide to advance, that there's actually something special about thinking about the self and the traits that it may or may not possess. So there's research that was groundbreaking in the 1970s called level of processing effect, which showed that the brain latches onto and remembers certain types of information more than other types of information. And what was first discovered, for instance, was that really surface level, like low levels of processing, like looking at whether a word begins with a capital letter or not, leads to poorer memory for the word than if you actually think about the meaning of the word. Like, is the word honest a good or bad quality to possess? So as you get past the surface levels of how do you pronounce the word, or is it capital letters or not, into the meaning, just thinking about meaning means you're more likely to remember the word in the future. So the brain is prioritizing that type of meaning information over surface level information, which is less relevant maybe to your long-term survival or well-being. But later in the 1970s, an additional layer of processing was discovered, which is if you look at a trait word like honest that could describe a person and you say, does the word describe me or not? You'll actually have better memory for that, seeing that word, if you think about whether it relates to you or not, compared to even thinking about, is the word good or bad? So there's like a deeper level of meaning, which is like, does it contribute to my self-concept in any sort of way, or am I rejecting it as part of my self-concept? That's actually even more valued and prioritized by the brain compared to even thinking about the meaning of words. And this is known as the self-reference effect. Right? So you get people to see a bunch of words, they do me or me, not me judgments, and then you sort of measure their memory for, did I see this word before or not, compared to, uppercase or lowercase judgments, for instance. And with the advent of neuroimaging, which let us look at what's happening in the brain, you could have people do that exact same kind of task when they're in a brain scanner. And if you do that, you can actually find that there's a set of brain regions right along the kind of midline of the brain, sort of like the shark's fin view, both in the front of the brain, the medial prefrontal cortex, and the back of the brain, the posterior cingulate cortex, that activate really strongly when people make these sort of me, not me judgments, above and beyond even like, is this a good or bad word, or is it uppercase or lowercase kind of word? And so this is sort of like the physical territory in the brain that's handling this prioritized processing of whether something fits in or not into this narrative about yourself. And so this was kind of a nice discovery. We're kind of figuring out what the self is and where it is. And rather than just tell you about it, we can just try it really briefly, because I'm a fan of doing kind of brief experiential exercises. So I'm going to show you at least one word, maybe a couple words, depending on time. And for each word that appears on the screen, I'd like you just to decide for yourself, you can say it silently to yourself, does this describe me or not? Or how do I feel about this word? And why, like as though you had to sort of justify why you're responding to this word or phrase that appears on the screen. Okay. And if you don't want to do it, then just you can twiddle your thumbs until we get through it. It'll only be a minute or two, and then we'll debrief and come back to the regularly scheduled lecture. Okay. So the first phrase I want to show it actually is this idea of your body. So you see the term like my body. What do you think about that? Thinking about your body, like, do you like it? Don't like it? Why? What comes up for you sort of experientially in terms of like, what's your story about your body? Do you have a story about your body? Like, I used to be good, and then potato chips happened. Like what, what is that story? And is there one available for you? Or you think about like whether or not you're stressed, like your stress level, what shows up there? Do you have a story about being stressed or not stressed? And you think about, there's a big one, the state of the world. It's a really big idea. Do you have a story about that? Like how things are going in the world? Is that ready? Is that readily available for you already? So for those of you who participated, thanks for participating. I'm wondering if we could just take a minute or two to do a little bit of a debrief. For you, how was that? Was there like a sense that you had answers ready already when you thought about these really abstract concepts? So you want to share anything interesting or surprising about their experience, or any feedback at all?
We have Alyssa here in the chat saying yes, and Suzanne saying yes as well. And
Okay.
if you want to, Suzanne saying instant responses and non-positive.
Non-positive, yeah. And I wasn't like flowers or like cute babies, like the state of the world, or like, yeah. That's cool. And did anyone have an experience where like there was nothing, like you had nothing to say, or no information came back to you from your mind? Yeah. So for most of us, there's already information just pre-packaged, right? And it's like our brain is like deeply already encoded how we feel about even really big abstract things, right? Even things that are personal, like our bodies or like how we're doing in life. And this is what I would sort of argue is like the conventional way of thinking about the self playing out, right? We have experiences, we have to make sense of them, so we fit them into our narrative. And it's really important that we do that. I'm not trying to sort of demonize that ability, and it actually uses like prioritizes certain brain areas that light up. And so it seems like humans have been doing this for a long time, and it's part of who we are, right? And it's so much part of who we are actually that as researchers started to develop that parts of the brain just sort of like automatically talk to each other and form networks that have certain functions. This set of brain regions that is especially tuned to doing these kind of me, not me judgments, to folding things into a narrative, have been found to be some of the brain regions that are on most often by defaults. So when you have someone in a brain scanner and they're doing some math task or memory task, and you tell them just relax for a second before we ramp up for the next thing we're going to ask you to do, these are the parts of the brain that turn on when you actually are just have like free time, right? And if you're getting kind of confused or bored or distracted in this presentation, even the types of things that your brain will do spontaneously will tend to be these type of sort of self-referential considerations, like why did I sign up for this? What's he talking about? What am I going to eat for lunch? You don't tend not to go off when you're bored and think about like, what is the color blue? Or like, I wonder, how a grasshopper's legs work. Like you could think about those things, but most of the things that pop into our mind tend to be these sort of self-referential narratives. So it's running so much that we would call them almost running by default. They use a lot of the architecture in the brain that's known as the default mode network, the part of the brain that lights up automatically, almost effortlessly. Like there just is something to know when you think about your body or the state of the world, or so on and so forth. And that's well and good. It could cause some issues for us down the road, which I'm going to get to in a second, but it seems necessary. But one thing that mindfulness really brings as a concept to the West, one reason I think that it's become so popular is that it offers us another avenue by which to relate to our experience. That's not purely story driven. It's not about justification. It doesn't have to necessarily make sense. There's this idea that we could actually attend to sensory information and do something that's radically different than just try to fit the next moment into our story. And it's probably not what we do by default. Might not actually use the same parts of the brain that we use to construct and integrate and evaluate things in terms of our story about what's going on. And I want to sort of just briefly try that out as well, just to give you a little bit of an experiential access. So I'm going to probably show you the same phrases again. I always say probably because sometimes I edit and then make a liar out of myself. But I'm going to try to show you roughly the same phrases again. And this time, even though it's the same kind of information coming at you, what I'd like you to try to do is, as an invitation, if you're willing, is to try to just notice when you see the words or hear me read the words to you, what shows up for you in terms of like automatic thoughts, but also like, do you notice any feeling in your body? Do you notice any feelings coming up? And rather than trying to explain or unpack or understand or narrate any one thing you feel, can you keep coming back to the present moment and ask yourself, what else can I be aware of right now as like a response to these cues? So is there something, am I feeling something? Is that changing? Is there a physical sensation? Is that changing from moment to moment? Or my thoughts popping in and out from moment to moment? So just try to ride the wave of all the different things you could sense in response to these phrases. And again, if you don't want to do it, totally voluntary. We'll come back to more standard lecture format in 2 or 3 minutes. So again, the first phrase is your body. You get told, how do you respond to the phrase, my body? My stress level. Someone says, are you stressed lately? Rather than coming up with a story, what would it be like to actually just listen? Like, am I stressed lately? Am I stressed right now? What does it feel like? Where in my body do I feel it? Do I feel it all the time? And the big one, the state of the world. Oh, the state of the world. The world's a big place. Thinking about the state of the world. How am I reacting to that? What's happening? What's playing out right now in my thoughts, feelings, and physical sensations when I think about the state of the world? Okay, great. So thanks to those of you who did that. Was there also information immediately kind of available there when you tried to approach your experience this way?
We also had a question here from Samia Norman, which is,
yeah, go ahead.
how do you define sensation in this context? A physical experience? Question mark.
Yeah, so I'm pretty open to it. I think it's just things that you can be aware of right now without having to elaborate or explain. Like that's not anything that you can just be aware of right now. It could be a thought, because a thought you could still think of as like what we'd call in the psych biz a sub-vocalized sound, right? So I just made the sound in my brain, like I'm confused, or I don't like this, or I do like this, right?
We have a couple of comments here. Michael said that you were adding different perspectives or lenses to view things by. So I guess that refers to the second exercise. Divya said she had to do it intentionally. Samia said that things came more readily for the first 2 as opposed to the third. Susan says I burst into tears when I settled into the stress in my body. I needed the release. Thanks. And wow. Catherine said, applying feelings instead of thoughts result in a sense of peacefulness. Constanza said, very clear sensations in the body. And Deb KT said, I thought I was fine. I feel differently.
Wow. Yeah. So, I mean, it was really rich. Thank you, everyone who already shared and participated. Yeah. So sometimes there's something there, like some cues, something's there, sometimes they're not. So feel it more readily for some than others. This feeling of maybe it's a bit different than what you would do automatically. So having to bring an intention to actually canvas momentary experience. For some people, you just get body sensation, you get raw sensation, and it's just clear. For some people, there are unexpected things happening, right? Or mismatches, right? Yes, you realize, oh, I have a narrative about something, and what I'm feeling right now, it doesn't necessarily line up. Sometimes there's a lot below the surface, and it comes to the surface, and there's this sense of release. So I think what I could say is an accurate summary, at the risk of trying to blanket over everyone's responses, is that there's a lot of different things that can show up, and some of them are sort of expected, and some of them can be really unexpected. So it's a little dangerous, right? But also it's a little bit potentially liberating or exciting to not know exactly how things are going to go and how they're supposed to go, right? So the ability to notice that you are actually getting information about yourself from a whole bunch of different sources. Like there isn't just one story that, and things are either fitting into the story or not, but actually you could have multiple streams of information that are still really important for like who you are and how you feel. And that they might not even agree with each other. Like it could be a kind of scary and challenging place to be. It's also a place that I would argue where there's a lot more possibility, right? Because once you have a whole bunch of different, sometimes really contrasting experiences happening at once, there's room to sort of pick and choose a little bit, to attend more to one, to attend more to another. It's not just sort of like this internal monoculture of like, here's my narrative and here's how things either do surprise me and violate that, or can be fit into it, right? You're not always comparing things to the same sort of baseline sort of story. And so we tried to look at this ability to toggle between what I would argue are actually two different modes of getting information about yourself, right? The narrative mode, where you try to fit things in, like, is this consistent or not consistent with my narrative? And teach people that sort of basic distinction, sort of like how we just sort of walk through it now. And contrast that to this idea of like, you can still find out things about yourself by being open to multiple streams of information and then not getting attached to any one little thing, right? And so being more in this kind of experiential, present-centered mode, which is probably a bit more consistent with what you might be asked to do in a mindfulness course or contemplative yoga practice. And we would get people to try to see these words like honest, dishonest, cowardly, loyal, appearing on a screen one at a time while they're in a brain scanner and an MRI. And we tried to see what was different in terms of what was happening in people's brains when they went from one mode to the other, while still seeing the same types of trait words appearing on a screen. But as an added wrinkle, we didn't just pick people off the street. We recruited people who were interested in doing mindfulness training. And we also compared what happened when people tried to shift between these modes when they had first signed up for a course but hadn't yet done the course, or when they'd completed an 8-week course where they were doing, a mindfulness-based stress reduction course where people are meeting once a week in a group format. They're learning different meditation techniques. They're supposed to practice for roughly an hour a day, like attending to sensation, being non-judgmental, being mindful, in other words, in both sort of formal practices and informal practices. Most people don't do an hour a day, but most people do like 2 or 3 hours a week. So you're still looking at it over the course of 8 weeks, like people who have about 25 hours of training, of just like focusing, being in the moment, letting go of judgment, being open, and to access this experiential mode, with the idea that if it's kind of hard to get yourself to let go of the narratives, you might see a bigger effect in people who have some training, right? So for the science junkies out there, this would be like a waitlist control design, right? You have everyone sign up, half the people get the training, half the people are about to get the training but haven't done it yet. And then we look to see if they toggle between these modes, the narrating mode and the experiencing mode, any differently. So when we look at people who have signed up for the course but haven't actually done much training, what we see is that when we ask them to kind of tell these narratives, this sort of like elaborative story, does it describe me or not, you get these same midline parts of the brain lighting up that I'd shown before had been associated with these me, not me judgments. And when you ask them to be more exploratory, be more sensory, be in this kind of experiential mode, what people do without training is they just find a way to kind of quiet down the narrative a little bit. So you see these same brain regions like turning off a little bit, but you don't really see full-blown activation of any other parts of the brain. They're not really able to step into another state of being. In other words, they're just able to turn down the self-talk a bit. Once you have people complete the 8 weeks of training, so let's say like 20, 25 hours of sort of mindfulness practice over 8 weeks, including some group work and lessons, you start seeing that they also can easily go into the story mode and turn it down. But they have this kind of new ability, which is to turn on a bunch of brain regions that are representing momentary experience on the surface of the body, which happens in the somatosensory cortex, which is kind of like, if you follow my headband here for my headphones, there's like a map of your body from your feet all the way down to your lips. And by the time you get down to your ears, and that part's activating a bit more. And then if you tuck in past where the lips area is and move forward a little bit into the insula, now you start getting to part of the brain that represents what's happening inside our bodies. So it still kind of follows a map, but it's a weird sort of like inside the body map. And that part is also activating more. And then you have parts of the front of the brain that control where attention goes that are activating more and that are helping to coordinate this sensory activity. So it seems like what the training helps people do is they can kind of get the distinction without training, but be able to sort of like sit in taking in sensory information and not get sucked back up into a narrative might take some kind of practice, especially given that we know that this sort of narrative network is like the default network. It's a network that we just intuitively or automatically turn towards when we're not intentionally doing something else. But with some practice, not years of practice, but weeks of practice, you can learn to more stably start to sit in this kind of sensory intake kind of place. So that's like kind of a cool party trick. You could go to someone and be like, hey, I can turn on my insula. Like, can I have your phone number? And then they would probably walk away. So like the question I would ask from that is like, okay, so we can be in this kind of sensory mode. Like, what good is that? Right? What does that buy us? Like, why is it just about having a different type of experience, or is there actually some sort of functional benefit to being able to engage in this mode? But before I get to that, I would say we've already sort of derived maybe one characteristic that I think shows you that you have like a real sort of effective form of mindfulness training, or however it's branded, is that this is a kind of training that should actually make you more flexible in how you relate to your experience, to realize that the way that you're seeing things right now, like the perspective that you're holding, is just one of many options. And if you even have two options on how you're looking at a situation, that is, I would argue, like a universe apart from only seeing things one way and not knowing that there are other ways to see it. There may actually be millions of ways to see a situation, but having the expertise to flexibly shift between at least two ways of perceiving a situation is a game changer. And I'm going to show how that might play out in terms of our emotions in just a second. Right. So any pressing questions now? Are you ready to keep onwards? Yeah. All right, let's keep going. I want to talk about why this matters other than the party trick. And so what we would, one area that mindfulness is sort of popularized on is helping people deal with, chronic medical conditions, depression, anxiety around those conditions, as though they've sort of been able to loosen themselves up a little bit for being stuck in this kind of negative place. And we're really interested in sort of modeling how that works. And again, I just want to emphasize, I'm not trying to give a lecture about how our narratives are bad. Just, I think they're totally essential. When someone says like, how are you doing today? It's not really supposed to stump you, right? Like, it's good to have that information ready all the time. It helps us figure out who we are and how we're supposed to relate to the world. And on the other side, when we do have those like bumps in the road, having a stable way of relating to our experience, like a stable way of knowing what's going on, can also be the source of a lot of suffering. So let's say you have your ice cream cone and it falls on the ground, and every life some ice cream must fall. What I argue is it's not really the fact that your ice cream fell on the ground that is causing deep suffering, even though it is, objectively bad to drop your ice cream. And you should maybe have this feeling of like, oh no, I thought I was going to enjoy that, and now I'm not. It's not actually where the suffering comes from. The suffering comes from when we integrate this local experience of like failure to maintain ice cream stability or balance, and we integrate that into a story about our lives, right? It becomes part of the narrative. And in fact, it reactivates some narrative about other times that we've messed up or failed. And so when you start thinking about like, well, I can't even hold on to an ice cream cone, how am I going to hold on to a romantic partner or a family or a job? This ice cream cone is just like one more indication that I am not good enough to make it in this world. That's where real suffering comes from. And so the same narrative that creates stability and gives us a sense of purpose and direction, when something happens in our lives that disrupts the grounds for that inference that we have meaning or direction or purpose, it can also create stability in a really dark place, right? Now the narrative is I'm the person who can't hold on to an ice cream and it's probably going to fail at everything else I do, right? And that's really a dark place to have to occupy in your waking moments. And this is known as kind of the broader appraisal we make about events, right? It's moving into the broader narrative. And if all we know how to do is spin stories about ourselves, and that's the primary way we relate to our experience, and then some challenging or bad things happen to us, and that becomes incorporated into part of our narrative, what we have now is a recipe for sustained suffering. Right? I thought things were going to go this way in my life, and now they're not. And so I'm the type of person who failed, or couldn't be loved, or pick the thing you say to yourself, right? When things are going well for you, that story is ready there and it's ready to be activated. And the more challenges and adversity we have in our lives, the more easily we can activate it because we have the more practice doing it. And so when we get into the kind of mindfulness practice where we're trying to learn how to flex our way into narratives, but also a way to flex our way out of narratives into just taking in new information and letting things be chaotic and unexpected and not well known, we're trying to have a bit of say for ourselves as to whether we're willing to just buy in wholeheartedly to that narrative way of knowing, right? Like even the whole process of having to tell ourselves a story and make sense of our experiences is already sort of like accepting that we have to have a narrative that's consistent about things. And then if we're rational people, maybe that narrative means, oh, then I guess I should be depressed, or I shouldn't try to find love again, or whatever it is. So we're saying like, just stop telling the story for a little bit. The story you're telling isn't necessarily helpful for you in this situation. Do you remember that there's another way you could relate to your experience that may be challenging, chaotic, upsetting, sometimes effortful to access, but at least affords the possibility of something other than what is already known, the most obvious interpretation that we've practiced. And so we tried to look at how that might play out in the brain. And so what we would do is we would show people movie clips while they're in the scanner. We'd show them their like home and garden television, which for most people is not particularly triggering, though there's always someone who had a bad gardening experience. And we would contrast that against really sad, though not violent or gory, but sad film clips, often themes of loss. So like a parent who has terminal cancer saying goodbye to their kids, like in terms of endearment. The 80s were a great time for these types of movies. These days, people don't want to wallow in their sadness as much. Though I've heard like people suggest like, oh, you should look at The Notebook, or like there are more recent like tearjerker movies that you can use as well. So we try to like show people these tearjerker scenes. We contrast that to relatively neutral, the trends in wicker basket construction for your garden or something like that, as a kind of a baseline. And we look at what happens to the brain when people are exposed to these kind of sadness inducing scenes. And we compare people who have completed one of these mindfulness training courses to people who have signed up but haven't yet developed that expertise. And we look at what their sadness looks like, both in terms of how sad they report themselves to be, but also what's happening to their brains when they report themselves feeling sad. And we try to understand, if to the extent there's a difference in how sadness is represented in the brain, does that explain anything around like their more broad sense of function, well-being, mental health? And so the first thing I want to show is that when you look at people who don't have mindfulness training and you expose them to these sad film clips, you get a kind of predictable activation all along the midline of the brain there. Again, that default network, they can't help but sort of tell a story about the way they're feeling. It includes that sort of medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate in the back. And these are the people who often come out of the scanner and being like, when I watched that mom on the screen say bye to her kids, it reminded me of all the stuff I've been going through with my own aging parents. And so it becomes like really self-referential, and they find a way to incorporate their sadness in the scanner with this broader arc of the narrative of sadness in their own lives. We kind of expected to see that, right? We're trying to provoke people, poke them a little bit emotionally. We think they're going to fall into their story because that's how we try to like understand and control our experiences. The other thing, though, that we found in people who haven't done much of this sort of training yet, it was kind of surprising, was that those sensory regions, the surface of the body, what's happening inside the body, the intentional control parts of the brain are actually shutting off in people without mindfulness training. And that was actually kind of surprising because, my naive prediction about sadness is like you feel sad, you just get flooded with all this visceral feeling from the body. But actually what sadness looks like over the course of 30 seconds, a minute at a time for people in the scanner is more storytelling and actually trying to block out any more sensory information from coming in. And so this was kind of unexpected, but really fascinating to think like it's not like the 5-year-old with like snot running down their nose and just like emotion is just like flooding viscerally out of their body. Like adults who are sad are actually trying to like getting really good at avoiding having to physically viscerally feel the sadness because they can escape into this story. Which makes sense in the short term, right? Like, well, I can get away from feeling it by trying to understand it because it doesn't feel good to feel these negative emotions. With mindfulness training, we still see the story mode activates, but not quite as much, especially in the back parts of the brain. This sort of storytelling narrative mode is no longer quite as active. And these parts of the sensory parts of the brain that we're turning off are no longer being turned off. So they're still telling a story about their sadness, but they're not doing that to the exclusion of taking in new sensory information. And when we look at how all of these differences between mindfulness trained people and the people who are just signed up for training but haven't done it yet are expressed in terms of what correlates with like how depressed they are, for instance, we can see it's not so much the storytelling that's explaining differences in who's depressed and who's not, because we have a wide range of severity of depression in people signing up for these courses. It's actually how much people tend to block out sensory information that is the best predictor of their depression. So the further down they go from watching home and garden television in terms of blocking out sensory information, the further out someone tends to go in terms of being more depressed. So that habit that we're seeing being expressed of blocking out sensation and doubling down on conceptual understanding is actually highly correlated with being more depressed. Which is kind of ironic, right? You're getting to be like an expert in blocking out immediately feeling like momentary negative feelings. And then you're rewarded for that expertise is you just feel terrible all the time. But if you think about the ideas I've been expressing to you, it makes sense, right? Because how are you getting away from feelings? Well, I'm trying to move into the system that gives me stable concepts over time. Well, what is a stable concept over time you're dealing with now? Oh, my sadness, right? And how feeling other times in my life I've felt sad or overwhelmed or like losing things. And this network's job is to sustain information over time. So even though you're getting away from the momentary sensation, you're also getting away from the possibility that you don't feel that way anymore, right? You've tapped into a network, this sort of red midline network here that perpetuates some information over time. And so what we're trying to do with mindfulness training is realizing like there are times that forming a stable, long-lasting concept about ourselves as suffering is not that skillful. And it would be lovely to sometimes, like with our choice, not to say we don't want to have narratives, but to sometimes limit the seemingly automatic and stable evaluation and storytelling process in the face of a stressor. Maybe if I was just sat with that bad feeling and I really explored it and noticed all these different aspects of it and how it changed over time, I might realize 5 minutes later that I'm actually not feeling that bad anymore. The movie clip is done and my body's kind of returning to baseline. But thinking about how this movie clip reminds me of how I had to deal with my own mother getting sick, I can keep playing that for hours and hours and talk to other people about it and rehearse it again. And like 10 hours later, I might still be feeling that same impact from that 30-second clip. So realizing that I have some choice in doing that, I'm actually a participant in perpetuating my negative story, and that I have something else I could do, which is just pay attention to sensation. Sensation is almost guaranteed to change and be chaotic, but also not just persist one sort of feeling over an extended period of time, might be really empowering. And so a second principle that comes out of this sort of research when you're thinking about like, how will I know this is like proper mindfulness or this is going to be something that's helpful for me, is I have flexibility in how I relate to my experience is kind of principle one. And principle two is it actually gets me willing to turn towards, right, to be curious and accepting of my experiences, even when they're intense or challenging, because I realize that's a way to prevent myself from getting stuck in any one way of relating to my experience. Right? So regardless of whether it's branded mindfulness or not, does it actually get you to turn towards, and hopefully in a kind of careful and responsible way, just like take on all negative feelings at a time, but learn to actually value the experience of feeling bad sometimes, because the experience of feeling means that things can still change. The experience of knowing is doubling down on that things aren't going to change. And so I'm going to learn to value even the bad stuff, because that's where change comes from. And we can see this playing out. I know we're almost coming up on the hour now, so I'm going to just talk about one study briefly, playing out in terms of real world pathology or wellness. In the the area that I study the most is depression, and people just relapse into depression. And this kind of horrible but very fascinating kind of understanding that every time you become depressed and then recover from an episode of depression, you've actually trained yourself to be more likely to become depressed again in the future, to the point where even minor things could set you off into a spiral back down into depression. So it's like a habit of falling into depressive narrative has been really well learned. And this is just showing that every time people become depressed in the past, they're more and more likely to fall off into depression again in the future. But I'm going to have to kind of skip over just into respect of everyone's time. But one clue that my colleague Zindel Siegel discovered was that the way you react to your momentary sadness is a really good predictor of whether or not you're going to be depressed in the future or not. So if you see something challenging, like a sad movie clip, or something stressful happens to you, and you start to think even more negative thoughts about yourself, like it shows like it actually increases the availability of this negative story, that's actually a big risk marker for becoming depressed again in the future. Whereas people who don't actually look like they're activating this sort of story mode even more in terms of just how they talk about themselves don't seem like they're at as high risk for a future depressive episode. So learning to not just fall back into the story could be useful. And so this implies that even though we might have genetic or developmental things that happen when we were kids that are going to make us maybe more fragile than others in terms of being more likely to become depressed, the way we relate to our experience affects things a lot too. Right? And that there's an option then to train ourselves not to just fall back into those same old stories. And so just to really in like a minute or two gloss over a very large study that we've been running over the past 5 years is we got hundreds of people to sign up for a study where they did cognitive therapy or mindfulness-based cognitive therapy who had a history of being depressed in the past, who had recently recovered. And then we followed them for 2 years to try to look at like, well, what did the people learn in these courses that distinguished the people who became depressed again over 2 years from those who found a way to stay well? And in the brain side of things, we found that it was the people who didn't shut out as much sensory information. Again, this is that sort of somatosensory hairband again turning off. The people who everyone shuns away from negative experience a little bit, but the people who don't shun away as much were the ones who tended to stay healthy. So we see this again replicated in a much larger cohort of people who are followed for 2 years, where now the outcome variable isn't just like how depressed do you feel right now, but are you likely to have a major episode of depression again in the future? Right? The people who don't inhibit a lot stay close to almost the whole group of low inhibitors stay healthy, like 90% of them, where almost 50% of people who are strong inhibitors end up relapsing over the course of 2 years. And it's not because one of them even did mindfulness training versus cognitive therapy. Actually, both interventions were useful. And so I want to sort of disabuse you of the idea that it has to be called mindfulness therapy for you to get these kind of insights and benefits. There may be more conceptual or behavioral access points from other types of interventions. But what we see is that there are three main things that could change for people that predict staying well. And then I'll try to wrap up. One doesn't really change much. It's just leftover bad symptom, like feelings that you have from your being depressed last time. That stuff actually doesn't change very much. That might come from your life history or from genetics or something like that. But how much people are able to perspective take and notice, I'm thinking about things in one way. What if I change the way I was thinking about them, which you call like metacognitive awareness, and how much they're willing to be with negative feeling without trying to avoid it, which we call distress tolerance, both increased a ton. That's the blue and green lines here over the course of the intervention, which is the very start of the graph up to the dotted line, and then continued to increase over the 2-year period. And the more that it increased, the less likely people were to become depressed. And so the last thing you might be asking is like, well, how do I make sure I can kind of increase these abilities? Well, what we found was that if you take a kind of course and there's practices you can do that are going to help you increase this ability to perspective take and be accepting of experience, the best thing that you can get out of a course like that is the ability to continue practicing when the course ends. And if you keep practicing when the course ends over time, and now we're talking months and years, not just like days, you might start then seeing that continued practice, especially when it becomes your own practice, like autonomous, starts pushing up these skills like decentering, perspective taking, acceptance. And the more you can push up these skills over time, the more resilient you are against a mood disorder or something like that. So it kind of points to this idea that being well is not just something we're gifted with. Yes, we're thrown onto this earth with different like sets of resilience or vulnerability, but it's also a skill that can be cultivated. And it's not really so much about learning how to just never feel bad, but it's about finding practices that actually help us become more flexible in how we relate to our experience and learn to tolerate the presence of negative experiences that might be the most valuable. And so there's this idea that, again, if it's really going to be a beneficial intervention, then it has to help promote this feeling of like growth and development. That's not just about, oh, I did the practice, but I'm getting something out of the practice that actually gives me more freedom in how I use my mind. And so the final bit I want to say there, because it's also include people doing cognitive therapy, is it actually doesn't really matter if it's called mindfulness or not at that point. If it has these qualities, it makes you more flexible and you can shift how you relate to your experience. You can actually be curious and not just automatically avoid challenging or unfamiliar or even flat out negative experiences. And you feel like you're growing in that ability over time. That's the recipe for long-term well-being. So I'm going to wrap it up right there. I just had sort of practical questions to leave it with. And I know we're coming up on an hour. So thank you everyone who attended. I'm happy to stick around and just do Q&A for a few minutes if people have questions, because I know I took up a lot of the time just chatting. But thank you so much for the invitation and having me here. And thank you everyone who participated and listened. And I just wish you the best in the future. And yeah, if you have to go, no worries. Otherwise, please feel free to ask questions and I'll try to give concise answers. I got to say just like that, it's important to remember that the evidence that put mindfulness into hospitals and now into schools and in government and things like that comes from these 8-week courses with a teacher. And they have a curriculum that they can deviate with somewhat, but they have to have a kind of common curriculum. And that if you want like the gold standard intervention and you want to deal with your stress and change how you relate to it, then like most of the evidence comes from like mindfulness-based stress reduction. If you want to deal with not relapsing into depression and seeing those patterns, that's what mindfulness-based cognitive therapy was developed for. So there are validated group interventions that I would say are like, if you can do that as your entry point, why not start there? Because you're going to have a teacher. That teacher hopefully has their own sort of accreditation and their own practice. You're going to have a group setting where you don't have to always be generating and sharing things when you're not up for it. There'll be a really strong structure there, but it is a big commitment and it's not always that available, right? 8 weeks, supposed to practice an hour a day, supposed to go to a class once a week. So then we get into like bargaining. Okay, so you don't want to do that. Like, what about an app? And then I guess the question with the app is, what is the content of the app? Like, are they explaining why you're doing things? Are they just telling you to sit with a timer and then hoping you figure it on your own? Is there feedback or support if you have questions? So like, are you getting a little bit of not just like a timed practice? Because maybe that's all you need if you already kind of have some prior experience. But if you're first coming to these sort of practices, like how is it going to help you understand some of these ideas that I've sort of tried to communicate in a very academic way, but a mindfulness teacher will also communicate about coming back to your body, valuing sensation. Is it helping you to do those sort of things? And I think if it is, then there's a lot of evidence, even from my own lab, that the apps can be really useful. And even if it's not, the apps can be useful, but they're useful maybe in a different way. So if the apps are helping you practice absorbed attention into physical sensation, like you're just going to focus on your breath, and the app is really good at getting you to do that, it's probably going to be still quite beneficial, but it's more likely that it's promoting relaxation than insight, let's say. If you want to have this idea of like growing the ability to change the way you relate to your experience, I think there needs to be at least some didactic component, like in that I mean, like there needs to be something that helps people understand like what they're up to with their practices, and equally importantly, on the feedback side, is there a way you can articulate what's going on for you and have some sort of feedback? And apps I think aren't that great at that yet. They're mostly like sort of guided meditation machines right now, but I think as the apps become more mature and web platforms become more mature, we'll start seeing that happen more and more. So to see what it's like is a formal meditation practice going to be something that feels rewarding to me? Is it a way of promoting relaxation? Are there certain patterns or insights that could show up for me? I think the apps are a great access point, but I think the gold standard is still like you need to find a teacher either through a course like a mindfulness-based, manualized course, or through maybe a more traditional spiritual teacher. It still seems like that's where you're going to get the most bang for your buck, but you still do get something from doing like a 10-minute a day kind of app. It's just you sort of get what you pay for. right? And the most likely thing you're going to get from doing a 10-minute a day body scan or breath monitoring app is relaxation, which could still be very, very valuable, but it's not the complete arc. Relaxation is about letting go of the narrative. It doesn't actually like help orient you towards valuing sensations, exploring, growing, the things that really make for, a change in your whole kind of like worldview and how your life is going. But if it's about just not like becoming overwhelmed and breaking down, finding a way to get some relaxation and some distance is still, I don't want to devalue that. That could be exactly
Right.
what someone needs. And in any given course, we'll see that different subsets of people in the course, some of them came there for relaxation and got it, and that's all they want. So like, let's not demonize that. it, it would be foolish not to learn from what thousands of years of human experience have taught us, which is the best way to anchor your practices is you have to have a community that supports those practices, right? The idea of Sangha, if you want to look like traditionally in religious contexts. But it doesn't necessarily mean you have to go join like X religion, but having other people who also value the practices you're doing is probably the best way to support them, especially given that like almost all of us will lapse at points in time in our practice. So even if it just means like having a buddy who's like your meditation buddy, even virtually now, like some apps like Insight Timer or things like that will connect you virtually to other people who are practicing at the same time. That can be really useful. And then on the more like what can you do as an individual side, it's about having a consistent routine. Like you want to fold this into your habit. Like you're going to keep using those narratives and the sort of habitual way of knowing, make that habitual way of knowing that you're the person who meditates at like 7:30 in the morning every day. And that's part of your routine. The same as forming like an exercise habit. So part of it is like willing yourself, like doing whatever it takes to get yourself doing it for 6 to 8 weeks until those habits start to like begin to form. And then the other side is from the outside in, like communicating what you're doing and finding other like-minded people who will check in with you about how things are going. And if you can't have a dedicated, like a teacher student relationship, at least try to have peers. And I think that's, the biggest negative feedback we get when we run groups is when the group ends and we haven't provided a framework for them to continue practicing in the group because they've made these like new friends and relationships and things like that. And I think there's still some work to be done in finding a way to make that easier for people. Yeah. So right now, like my lab directly is running a lot of stuff for undergrad stress, especially as they move online. So we're looking at kind of the other end of things is like the very first access point to having intentionality around self-care is the stuff I've been working on mostly. So how do you get like an 18-year-old who uh, isn't like their priority is not like let me make sure I'm taking care of myself for when I'm 60. Like they're like I'm 18, like it's time to live. And it's like okay, well how do you bring in like 3 minutes of checking in with yourself in a day, and maybe a little bit of intention setting. And how do you do that in a way that doesn't turn people off or that they won't abandon at the time they need it most? When's the right time to intervene? So we're doing a lot of that kind of stuff that is a far cry from a full meditation program. But there are, my colleagues in Del Sigo who developed mindfulness-based cognitive therapy has a platform called Mindful Noggin, which is like MBCT online. And it actually has like coaches and things like that. So we're trying, I think a bunch of different fronts, people are trying to develop apps that do that sort of thing. But, for me, that initial access point is really important. The other thing I'm super interested in is developing games that tap into some of these capacities that people can play that are both diagnostic. So they'll tell you how you're doing relative to yourself in the past or relative to a cohort of other people of similar demographics that have played the games, but are still contacting some of the skills that we think are sort of essential skills, like the ability to sustain attention over time, the ability to notice your mind has wandered, the ability to detect changes in your own breathing rate even. So we're kind of like deep into the programming of that. I'm hoping that in the next year or two, we'll have a platform of like, the mindful gym in a way, not to replace the primary practice, but as sort of check-ins for people that don't involve like having a whole bunch of beliefs or like book learning, that still give you a little bit of way of being like, yeah, your attention is quite stable, but but your attitudes tend to be quite judgmental or negative. So how do people get like that kind of quick readout for themselves, that where they themselves are providing the information, but we're just helping to curate their ability to check in these certain domains, then actually aggregating that information over time to make it feel a bit more personalized and sort of identify like, here's a place you can work a bit more. Here's a place where you seem like you're doing okay in terms of because if these are really skills, we should be able to assess these skills and see them develop over time. And conversely, if you're doing a practice and you're getting no movement on any of these skills, you should do a different practice, right? Like, let's not be dogmatic about,
Right.
well, everyone benefits from the body scan, so you must be doing it wrong. It might be like, yeah, except for the 40% of people who after they do a body scan realize they don't like it, and it maybe is triggering to them or just isn't the right access point. So we need like a set of benchmarks that should move if we're going to be flexible about the inputs, like the training that people are going to do. So that's the stuff we're doing a lot in my lab now. And yeah, it's a lot of like programming and like user interface stuff, and trying to that at the same time think back, like, what is the thing we're trying to measure here? Like, not lose sight of that amidst all the tech.